Joe Rogan and Brigham Buhler begin with a light exchange about Austin allergies and supplements, then quickly turn to the issue that Buhler says has defined the last several years of his work: restoring peptides to legitimacy in American medicine. He describes the FDA's previous stance as hostile and opaque, saying he filed 17 FOIA requests asking why certain peptides were deemed dangerous and never received a response. That experience made the issue feel less like science and more like bureaucratic stonewalling. What has changed, he says, is the political environment under Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s HHS. For the first time, Buhler feels genuine optimism because he believes there is finally a seat at the table and a voice. Rogan argues that part of that optimism comes from the fact that Kennedy actually uses peptides himself, understands their effects, and is healthy enough to judge their practical value. To Rogan, that matters because millions of people are already using peptides and reporting real benefits. Buhler ties that point to his own story. He says he was once obese, on the edge of diabetes, and committed to the standard annual checkup model before concluding that the system was not built to create health. That personal shift leads to the episode's first major theme: the clash between lived outcomes and institutional dogma. In Buhler's view, regulators struggle with peptides because they do not fit the normal pharmaceutical model. Many are naturally occurring molecules and are often used in preventive, optimization, or cash pay settings rather than in insurance-driven disease treatment. He credits Kennedy, advisor Stephanie Spear, and FDA Commissioner Marty Makary with being more willing to question medical groupthink and listen to new arguments. By that point, peptides are framed not as a fringe topic, but as a test case for something much larger: whether American medicine can make room for preventive, personalized therapies outside the old insurance pharma regulator framework. A concrete stretch of the conversation focuses on testosterone replacement therapy and the enduring fear that it causes prostate cancer. Rogan says he often encourages older friends to get their hormones checked, only to hear the same objection: concern about prostate cancer. Buhler responds bluntly, arguing that this fear was built on a study from the 1930s involving only 3 patients. One dropped out, one stayed normal, and one was chemically castrated. In his view, medicine turned that tiny sample into decades of caution and black box fear. He lays out the reasoning with a receptor saturation model. If a man starts with almost no testosterone and is brought up into a low normal range, Buhler says there may be a theoretical concern about stimulating an existing prostate cancer during that rise. But once receptor sites are saturated and testosterone reaches a healthy physiologic level, he argues, the effect does not keep increasing. As he puts it, you can only water a plant so much. From there, he makes a broader claim. He says there is no study showing that testosterone therapy causes prostate cancer. He points to later work, especially research he attributes to Dr. Abraham Morgentaler in the 1990s, as challenging the old assumption by showing no increased prevalence or worsening in men treated despite prostate cancer concerns. He also argues that if TRT truly drove prostate cancer, today's widespread use would have created an obvious rise in cases, which he says has not occurred. Rogan is struck that such a powerful belief could rest on such shaky foundations. Buhler says that is how medical dogma takes hold. An idea gets repeated in training, reinforced at conferences, and hardened into orthodoxy until it functions like an urban legend. For both men, testosterone becomes a case study in how weak premises can shape care for decades, and a warning that the same pattern may now be repeating with peptides, stem cells, and other forms of preventive medicine. Buhler argues that peptides run into regulatory resistance because the U.S. drug approval system was built for large pharmaceutical companies, patentable products, and insurance reimbursement, not for naturally occurring compounds sold directly to informed patients. In his view, when bringing a drug to market costs anywhere from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, that expense creates a moat that favors conventional drugs and shuts out lower-cost, cash-pay, nature-derived therapies. He stresses that peptide advocates are not asking for Medicare, Medicaid, employer coverage, or government mandates. They want patients to be free to pay out of pocket for preventive and personalized treatments. That difference is central to his argument. Big Pharma depends on broad reimbursement to recover massive development costs, while peptides, stem cells, and similar therapies are meant to be affordable enough to buy directly. Regulators, he says, are so accustomed to an insurance-based model that they struggle to recognize this alternative. Buhler also disputes the claim that peptides lack meaningful evidence. He says his side submitted more than 800 studies on 19 peptides restricted under the Biden administration, and points to over 90,000 patients treated through ways to well, without the kind of safety problems critics suggest. To him, the problem was not clear evidence of harm, but a system unwilling or unable to evaluate treatments that do not fit its established categories. Rogan reinforces the point by noting that GLP-1 drugs are peptides too. That matters because peptides are often framed as fringe anti-aging compounds, even though one of the most prominent drug classes in America belongs to the same category. For Buhler, that exposes a contradiction. Mainstream medicine accepts plenty of off-label improvisation, but grants legitimacy mainly to products that move through familiar institutional channels. His conclusion is that peptides occupy an unstable middle ground, neither supplements nor standard drugs, difficult to patent, and hard to reimburse, which leaves them uniquely vulnerable in a system that has no natural place for preventive, cash-pay medicine. The podcast's deepest policy discussion centers on GLP-1 weight loss drugs and the claim that today's crackdown on compounding grew out of their explosive popularity. Buhler says lobbyists for Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk sold lawmakers a simple, persuasive message. These companies spent billions developing breakthrough drugs, and compounders and independent pharmacies are now violating their patents. He admits that argument sounds compelling, especially when politicians hear little else. But he argues, the real story is more complex. Many blockbuster drugs, he says, begin with NIH-funded research, meaning taxpayers helped support the underlying science before pharmaceutical companies licensed and commercialized it. Rogan reacts with disbelief, and Buhler calls the arrangement absurd. He also rejects the idea that compounding during GLP-1 shortages was some unlawful gray market. In his view, it was a recognized regulatory response. The FDA declared a shortage, compounders stepped in to fill unmet demand, and only afterward were they accused of stealing the market. Buhler also attacks Lilly's economic claims. He says the company multiplied its value several times over, reached an extraordinary valuation, and benefited from what he calls the biggest blockbuster molecule in history. Compared with that scale, he argues, the compounding industry's temporary earnings during the shortage were negligible. He also points to what he sees as hypocrisy. Lilly warns regulators about the dangers of peptides sourced from China, while reportedly making a multi-billion-dollar deal for a Chinese peptide company. For Buhler, the larger issue is precedent. If pharmaceutical companies succeed in pushing more products into categories that extend exclusivity or limit compounding, the fight will not end with GLP-1s. Rogan sums it up bluntly. They do not just want to win, they want only them to win. The section ultimately frames the peptide battle as a contest less about science or safety than about market control, lobbying power, and who gets to shape policy. The conversation expands into a sweeping critique of American healthcare. Buhler describes three models, starting with the conventional insurance-based system, which he calls sick care. In his view, it is dominated by insurers, regulators, and pharmaceutical companies, and built to manage symptoms rather than prevent chronic disease. He points to what he sees as catastrophic outcomes. Roughly 1.7 to 1.9 million Americans dying each year from chronic disease, even as the U.S. remains the most expensive and among the sickest healthcare systems in the world. Rogan pauses at the scale of those numbers, but Buhler uses them to explain why he has no interest in minor reforms. He argues that the typical primary care visit gives doctors only a few minutes and little room to investigate root causes. In that environment, patients who are overweight, inflamed, anxious, or depressed are funneled toward the usual interventions: cholesterol drugs, GLP-1s, antidepressants, and rapid follow-up. To him, that may fit billing structures, but it is not real preventive care. He contrasts that with a longevity-focused clinic model, where patients undergo broad diagnostics and a slower assessment of hormones, insulin resistance, inflammation, body composition, and lifestyle. Using Jelly Roll as an example, Buhler argues that a standard clinic likely would have started with weight loss drugs and multiple prescriptions, whereas Weistowell tried to first improve insulin function, hormones, estrogen balance, and inflammation to create early momentum. The point, he says, is not a single miracle treatment but a layered strategy. When Buhler claims the average American takes 4 or more prescriptions, Rogan again stops him because it sounds unbelievable. For Buhler, that statistic captures a prescription-first culture. His larger mission is not just peptides, but personalized, predictive, preventive medicine powered by diagnostics, wearables, AI, and more accessible concierge-style care. The current system, he says, works well for emergencies but fails at preserving long-term health. After laying out a broader critique of healthcare, the conversation turns to Buhler's own model. Rogan tells him he seems like an actual good dude trying to help people, not just maximize profit, which lets Buhler explain what he sees as the core difference at Weistowell. From the beginning, he says, the rule was simple: make people the North Star. Rogan jokes that it sounds hippie, but agrees with the larger point that in public companies and large healthcare platforms, fiduciary pressure can make patient-first care hard to sustain. Buhler contrasts Weistowell with firms like Hims and other venture-backed telehealth companies, which he sees less as true medical practices than as massive marketing machines. In his view, many are sliding into pill-mill behavior around peptides and GLP-1s, optimizing for fast customer conversion rather than careful treatment. He says he still believes AI is important, but he no longer sees it as the main answer by itself. Everything always starts with people, he argues. AI should extend the reach of good clinicians, not replace them. He is especially critical of telehealth models that pay doctors hourly to jump across unrelated specialties, saying that while this may expand access, it often erodes quality. The practical distinction, he argues, is incentive alignment. In cash pay care, patients are spending their own money and can walk away if treatment does not work. That creates accountability. By contrast, in insurance-driven care, payers, networks, and pharmacy benefit managers often shape decisions through restrictions and rebates. Buhler says owning both clinics and pharmacy operations can improve price and quality while still allowing patients to fill prescriptions elsewhere. He acknowledges that scaling this model is difficult and that rapid growth brought friction. But he argues the solution is not lower standards. The goal is a middle path, not luxury concierge care for a tiny elite, and not mass-market drug vending, but technology-supported, personalized care that ordinary people can actually afford. One of the sharpest examples of market gamesmanship in the episode is Buhler's criticism of Hims. He argues that the backlash against compounding was not purely a safety response, but was strategically sparked by a company that never planned to remain in that lane. His claim is that Hims ran a Super Bowl ad using the brand name of Novo Nordisk's GLP-1 drug in a way he says violated compounding rules, then soon after signed a deal with Novo to distribute the branded product. Buhler says compounders marketing a compounded medication are supposed to use the generic compounded name, not suggest a direct branded equivalent. He compares it to advertising Kleenex for cheaper than Kleenex. In his view, Hims knew exactly what it was doing. He dismisses any accident narrative and argues the move was designed to trigger a regulatory firestorm that would hit the broader compounding sector just as Hims pivoted into a pharma partnership. The sequence is central to his argument. He says regulators and lawmakers reacted strongly to what looked like direct-to-consumer infringement, black market-style promotion, and a clear violation of compounding norms. Then, within weeks, Hims had a source agreement with Novo, its stock rose, and the rest of the industry was left with the fallout. He notes that a class action and antitrust suit is now probing the episode, though Rogan doubts any eventual revelation will get more than brief attention. For Buhler, the larger lesson is that bad actors, whether reckless or deliberate, make it easy for regulators to collapse responsible compounders, gray market peptide sellers, and aggressive marketers into one suspect category. That is why he keeps emphasizing process, chain of custody, and lawful clinical oversight. Rogan sees greed at scale. Buhler sees how fragile emerging medical pathways can be. When one company chases short-term advantage, the resulting crackdown can punish clinicians and patients who are actually trying to follow the rules. Buhler is most emphatic about the peptide black market. In his view, the cat is out of the bag. People know these compounds exist, believe they work, and will keep seeking them out. That is why his key statistic matters. He claims 4 out of 5 peptide prescriptions are now being filled through gray or black market channels. For him, the policy question is no longer whether peptide use can be stopped, but whether it can be pushed back into regulated systems. Rogan points to the obvious consumer risk: people buying products online that may not contain what they claim. With compounds like CJC/ipamorelin, users often expect a noticeable effect, so when they feel nothing they assume the product is fake. Buhler says some gray market products are real, but even authentic versions may be dangerously misdosed. A GLP-1 at double strength, he warns, could lead to muscle wasting or other serious harms. He also describes the legal fiction many sellers rely on, labeling products for non-human use, while influencers openly market them for human injection. Buhler says he warned one peptide CEO that a serious adverse event would bring Department of Justice scrutiny, exposing the contradiction between labeling and promotion. According to him, that crackdown is already beginning, with FBI visits to several gray and black market peptide facilities. His proposed solution is simple: restore legal access through clinicians, pharmacists, and inspected compounding pharmacies. He contrasts his own operation, which uses FDA-recognized ingredient suppliers, undergoes state and federal inspections, and verifies dosages through third-party testing, with black market sellers who offer no physician oversight, no pharmacist guidance, no safe reconstitution instructions, and no accountability. He calls the current environment the Wild West, and argues that shutting down legitimate channels only drives more people into that chaos. His appeal to regulators is ultimately conservative: bring peptides back under professional supervision, so public demand is met through lawful, accountable medicine, rather than an expanding underground market. Buhler frames the next stage of health optimization as a predictive system that combines genetics, body composition testing, wearables, blood work, and AI to track health span in real time. Blood work, he says, is useful but only a snapshot. The real value comes from integrating many data streams, including DEXA scans, VO2 max, body fat distribution, bone density, sleep, biomarkers, and eventually full genome sequencing. His broader point is that people often know their phone's software version better than what code our body's running on. He argues that very few people have had their genome sequenced, and that medicine has barely begun to use this information well. To illustrate, he points to Gordon Ryan, whose sequencing, he says, revealed rare combinations of genes that may help explain both extraordinary athletic ability and chronic health issues. According to Buhler, Ryan carries markers linked to unusually durable connective tissue and higher bone mineral density, alongside markers tied to immune vulnerability, recurring staph susceptibility, and a more acidic gut environment. He extends this idea to other elite athletes, including Devin Larratt, saying they also show unusual genetic combinations. The bigger implication is that, as these patterns are mapped across millions of people, medicine can become far more individualized. AI, in this vision, could identify which people with certain markers respond best to specific interventions, or who should change lifestyle decades earlier because of elevated disease risk. The conversation becomes more speculative when Buhler discusses future gene editing and gene activation, invoking the possibility of enhancing traits like bone density, and studying unusual biological models such as Greenland sharks or the so-called immortal jellyfish. Rogan is intrigued but keeps returning to practical concerns about side effects and trade-offs. The core takeaway is that Buhler sees medicine shifting from blunt symptom management towards software-level biology, understanding each person's genetic firmware, and using integrated data to prevent disease and optimize function long before symptoms appear. The episode's final stretch turns to regenerative medicine, focusing on stem cells, Muse cells, and plasma exchange. Buhler is especially animated about Muse cells, which he says he initially doubted. After traveling to Japan with his chief science officer, Ian White, to meet researcher Mari Dazawa, he says he became convinced they could be transformative. Muse cells, multilineage differentiating stress-enduring cells, are described as a tiny subset of stem cells, under 2%, that can survive harsh conditions, avoid harmful immune reactions, and differentiate into damaged tissue. Buhler tells their discovery almost like a parable. Dezawa accidentally left cells out overnight after dinner, expected them to die, and found that a small subset survived. From that, he says, research suggested Muse cells can home in on damaged tissue, cross barriers more effectively than traditional mesenchymal stem cells, and adopt the phenotype of injured cells through phagocytosis. In his analogy, they act like Pac-Man, engulfing a damaged cell and becoming a younger, healthier version of it. He keeps returning to three strengths: safety, pluripotency, and better engraftment, which he says may reach 15 to 30% versus 3 to 5% for standard MSCs. He also points to early reports of no tumor formation, possible tumor shrinking effects in animals, and dramatic international anecdotes, including children with encephalitis recovering function and a comatose crash victim improving. Rogan is especially struck by the idea that Muse cells may cross into the midbrain, raising hopes for Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases. The conversation then shifts to plasmapheresis, or therapeutic plasma exchange, which Buhler calls an oil change for your body. He says the process removes inflammatory material from plasma, replaces it with albumin and regenerative components, and may eliminate about 70% of unwanted contents in a single session. He links this to concerns about microplastics and endocrine disruption, then closes with a broader optimism. If states move faster than Washington, the U.S. could build regulated, affordable regenerative care hubs and usher in a new medical era.